Hi, this is Tom Santos with Lesson 3 of the Flour Detective, Salt, Sugar, and Oil. Again, we're going to talk about consistency equals quality. Now, if you're making a dough, be it a pizza dough or bread dough, you have 4 ingredients: flour, water, salt, and yeast. Those are the only things you need to make a decent pizza or a decent dough. Optionally, especially in the New York and really across the country, oil and sugar is added to the dough. So each of them have a specific function. The first one I'm going to talk about is salt. Salt is a flavor enhancement. If you do not have salt in your dough, it's going to be so bland to eat. You won't have any flavor. Really, you could put the best sauce and cheese in the world on it. If you have no flavor, it really doesn't do much for it. And the dough is, as we like to say at General Mills, is the most important part of the pizza. But what salt does is fermentation control. Now, you remember when I was talking about yeast and the way the dough would rise, the CO2 gases, how the yeast eats sugar to create the CO2 gases and make the dough rise and create that beautiful flavor. What salt tells the yeast to do is to slow down. Salt is almost like, when you're talking about salt and sugar, it's the yin and yang of making dough. Salt tempers the yeast. It says, slow down, don't eat so much sugar, because if the yeast eats too much sugar, it eventually will die. Salt also has a dough strengthening property. Very important to have salt in the correct proportion in your dough. Sugar, as I said, is food for the yeast. Now, I know we talked about yeast, but yeast will eat all the sugar. If it can, it will eat all the sugar in the dough, and when it's done with the sugar, it'll eat the carbohydrates in the dough. Once it's gone through the sugar and carbohydrates, the yeast dies. There's nothing else for the yeast to do, and it just dies, and that's when your crust won't brown. Sugar makes it brown. It gives the caramelization. It gives it some keeping quality. The salt regulates the sugar and makes the dough come up with that nice, slow fermentation that creates the aroma and flavor in the dough. One thing about Neapolitan, you're going to come across a lot of Neapolitan-style pizza in your travels. Neapolitan dough has no sugar. Neapolitan dough is a longer fermentation time. If you take a Neapolitan dough and you're making a Neapolitan dough, it's those 4 basic things. It's salt, flour, yeast, and water. You mix it, you boil it out, and you put it in the refrigerator probably 2 to 3 days before you use it. Reason being, there's no sugars, there's very tiny little bit of yeast, and it takes a long time to ferment. And that long time, that 2 to 3 days, develops that rich flavor that the Neapolitan pizza is known for. I'll give you a tip. If you get a call from a customer and they're saying, geez, I opened my bin and my dough, it sort of smells like old beer, it doesn't smell, right away we know there's something wrong. It'll also be flat. That means the yeast is dead. But one way you could tell, if you flip that dough over, the bottom of the dough will have little spots on it. They're little brown or black spots, and that's nothing but the ash from the flour. Nothing harmful or anything like that. It just indicates the yeast has died. And that could be as simple as too little salt, too much sugar, and especially too hot of water. And we had talked about that on a previous Flour Detective. If you're not tempting your water and it's hot outside, that yeast is going to rifle through that sugar, and the dough is going to balloon up, over ferment, and then just collapse and die. So 2 things to remember: salt and sugar and the effect on fermentation, and how the heat also has a major impact on the fermentation. Talk about oil a little bit. Oil is the lubrication with the dough. It gives it a little bit of stretch, extendability, some browning effect. Most important is a keeping quality. If you have a customer who's making a New York style pizza, remember, we can't use oil in Neapolitan style pizza. Most other pizzas will use oil. But if you have a customer who has a heat lamp and is selling slices, very important that they maybe up their oil a little bit. If they're at 4 to 6%, they may want to go to 5 to 7%. The reason being, those heat lamps are brutal on a pizza dough after it's baked. It sucks out some of the tenderness of the dough. Adding a little more oil under that to the dough will when you put it under the heat lamp, it'll allow that dough to remain tender and easier to eat. If you don't have enough oil in the dough and you put it under a heat lamp, it's going to turn to cardboard probably within an hour or so if they're leaving it there. So that's a flour detective tip. If you see a heat lamp, ask how much oil you're using. It's an easy question. And if they say, well, I'm using, a quart or whatever they say, and ask them if they're getting any complaints on the tenderness of the dough. If they say, yeah, you need to up your oil. And then you become a consultant instead of a salesperson. So I want to talk about scaling dry ingredients. We showed you how to scale the wet ingredients. Same thing with the dry. Here I have just a little sugar, and this scales out. It's 4 ounces, exactly 4 ounces. 4 ounces are always 4 ounces. Now I'm going to turn this off. I'm going to tare the bowl, and I just want to show you trying to get to 4 ounces with teaspoons. If somebody says, well, 4 teaspoons is 3 ounces or 2 ounces, let's try it. Let's see what 4 teaspoons actually is. Because you'll have customers who will tell you, well, I use 4 teaspoons, and 4 teaspoons equals a certain amount here. Now, this happens, and I'm glad we're showing this here because this happens all the time when you're out in the field. The scale is giving you a little hard time, just turn it off. Don't try and go back, just turn it off. Again, we're cycling through, same thing. We're going to tare it. So I'm going to put 4 I can't actually see the camera could, but I can't. So that's 4 teaspoons, and that comes out to 9/10 of an ounce. So if they're using 4 teaspoons, I'm going to do it again to see am I going to be able to get the same amount the next time I use teaspoons? Now I'm less than an ounce. Again, that's over 1/10 of an ounce. When you're talking sugar, salt, and any type of dry ingredients, think of something as small as 1 ounce, and I'm off 1/10 of an ounce. Multiply that by 10, it could be as much as 8 to 10 to 12 ounces, and that will make a huge difference on any dough you're making. So again, 4 ounces is always 4 ounces. 4 teaspoons could be anything. And I want to tell you a story. It actually happened in New York a number of years ago. And I was talking to a customer about oil. And I was asking him, I said, geez, how much oil do you use? And he said, well, I use 4 glug-glugs. And I was like, what are you talking about? What's a glug-glug? And he goes, well, I take the oil and I pour it. It goes glug and it goes back. That's a glug-glug. 1 glug-glug, 2 glug-glugs. I could assure you, I've talked to the culinary experts at General Mills, and there's no such thing as an exact weight for a glug-glug. Make sure you're always weighing stuff out. Very, very important. Consistency equals quality.